The electromagnetic tempest outside the observatory windows looked like something alive. Great sheets of violet and silver energy that twisted through Ethermore's atmosphere, like serpents made of lightning. Kestrel stood before the glass, her translucent skin catching the fractured light, watching the storm with the patience of someone who had watched it for 247 years. She didn't flinch when the next wave of plasma crashed against the protective barriers. The wards held. They always held. That was, after all, her purpose. The alert chimed softly in the observation chamber, a sound like wind chimes, made of crystallized time. Kestrel's golden eyes, which held the depth of nebulae, flickered toward the source. A proximity warning. Something had breached the outer perimeter. Through the telescopic displays, she saw it. A vessel, human-made, spiraling downward with failing engines. Its trajectory was erratic, desperate. It would crash. She should have let it fall into the planet's scarred surface and disappeared. That was the protocol. Her duty was to maintain the observatory, to guard the archive, to ensure nothing disturbed the sacred work of preservation. Visitors were forbidden. Interaction was prohibited. She was a sentinel, not a savior. But something in the way the ship tumbled so chaotic, so lost, stirred something in her that had been dormant for centuries. Perhaps it was the whisper of the archive itself, that ancient consciousness that lived in the walls and spoke in frequencies most beings could never perceive. Or perhaps it was simply the terrible, aching loneliness that had become her constant companion, a weight she had learned to carry so well she almost forgot it was there. The ship struck the western plains with an impact that shook the observatory's foundation. Kestrel felt the tremor in her bones, in the very essence of her being that was intertwined with this place. She closed her eyes. She told herself she would not go. She told herself it was not her responsibility. She told herself 1,000 rational reasons why the human in that wreckage should remain. Where they fell, she was already moving toward the lower levels before the list finished forming in her mind. The storm raged around her as she approached the crash site, her form barely visible within her protective luminescence, a pale blue glow that cut through the violet chaos like a pathfinder's beacon. The ship was half buried in the silver sand, its hull crumpled like discarded foil, its emergency lights blinking weakly. Debris scattered across the dunes like the bones of some great creature. The human lay near the airlock, half conscious, half frozen. His suit was shredded. His breath came in ragged gasps that turned to ice crystals in the hostile air. His dark hair was matted with blood. His eyes, when they flickered open, were the color of storm clouds, gray and tumultuous and filled with something that looked disturbingly like surrender. "Don't," he murmured when he saw her approach, his voice rough with cold and pain. Don't waste effort. Let me stay here." Each word seemed to cost him something. Kestrel studied him, this fragile, determined, broken thing. There was something in his request that resonated with her own decades of solitude. He wasn't asking for rescue. He was asking for permission to disappear. She understood that language well. She bent and lifted him, surprised by how light he was, how easy it was to cradle him against her luminous form. He tried to resist, tried to speak more words of surrender, but the warmth she offered was too compelling. His protests faded into unconsciousness as she carried him back toward the observatory, toward light and warmth and the terrible, beautiful possibility of connection. The archive's healing chamber was the first refuge she thought of, not the chambers designated for guests, because there hadn't been guests into centuries. The walls here were embedded with ancient biotechnology, systems older than human civilization itself. She placed him on the crystalline bed and initiated the restoration protocols, watching as pale blue light began to flow over his broken body, knitting wounds, stabilizing his core temperature, drawing him back from the edge of death. She should have left then, should have returned to her duties while he recovered in isolation. But instead, she found herself settling into the chair beside his bed, watching his breathing steady, watching the color return to his frost-burned cheeks. She watched him the way one watches a candle flame, half afraid it might go out, half afraid of what the darkness would feel like if it did. When he woke, the first thing he did was try to sit up. The second thing he did was curse with impressive creativity. "Easy," Kestrel said, moving closer. Your body requires more time for integration." He focused on her then, really looked at her. And Kestrel saw the moment reality reasserted itself in his gray eyes. "What are you?" he asked, and there was wonder in the question, but also wariness. "Where am I?" "You are in the observatory of Ethermore," she said, keeping her voice calm, measured. "I am Kestrel. You crashed. I retrieved you from the storm." "I don't remember." He trailed off. Then something flickered across his face, a memory, perhaps, or an intention he was reluctant to revisit. "You should have left me there. I considered it," Kestrel admitted, and something in her directness seemed to startle him. "But the archive does not accept suffering when it can be prevented. That is my programming, my purpose, the archive." His eyes moved around the chamber, taking in the pulsing lights beneath the crystalline surfaces. The way the air itself seemed to sing with ancient knowledge. "What is this place?" "A library," she said simply. "A sanctuary for the forgotten records of 1,000 civilizations. A monument to all that was nearly lost." He stared at her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with something like despair. "I'm stranded, aren't I? My ship is destroyed. My communications are down. I'm trapped on an alien world with no way off." "Yes," Kestrel said, because she had learned long ago that truth was cleaner than compassion. "But not alone. That is what differs from your intention. You are not alone now." Something shifted in his expression, not quite acceptance, not yet, but perhaps a small crack in the wall of his hopelessness. He looked away, then back at her. "I'm Cajun," he said finally. "Astrophysicist. I was on a solo mission. Independent research vessel. I should have never flown into that storm." He paused. I think I might have intentionally ignored the weather warnings." Kestrel understood what he was telling her. She had watched enough humans arrive at this planet over the centuries to know the various languages of despair. "You sought oblivion," she said. "I sought solitude," he corrected. But it sounded like a lie they both knew. "My research had failed. Everything I believed in was wrong. My family had stopped believing in me. I thought it would be better if I simply stopped being, if I just..." He didn't finish. Kestrel found herself moving without conscious thought, settling onto the edge of his bed. She had been trained to maintain distance, to never allow emotional connection, to see herself as a tool of preservation rather than a being of consciousness. But something in this damaged human's vulnerability called to something in her that had been waiting centuries to respond. "You were wrong," she said softly. "The universe does not wish you to disappear. It sent me to catch you." Cajun really looked at her, and his gray eyes filled with something that might have been tears. "Is that what happened? Did the universe send you? Or am I dead? Is this heaven? Because it's too strange to be real." A sound emerged from Kestrel's throat that, after centuries of silence, took her a moment to recognize as laughter. "No," she said. "You are alive. This is real. And you are welcome here, Cajun of the stars. For now, for as long as you need. You are not alone anymore." Outside, the storm raged on, violet and silver and eternal. But inside the observatory, something warmer had begun to bloom, the fragile, impossible beginning of two broken souls finding shelter in each other's unexpected presence. 3 weeks had passed since Cajun woke in the healing chamber, and the observatory had become less a prison and more a sanctuary. He was afraid to examine too closely. The walls seemed to breathe with him now, the soft hum of the archive's consciousness settling into his bones like a second heartbeat. He had stopped thinking about rescue and started thinking about why he hadn't wanted to be rescued in the first place. Kestrel had become the measure of his days. She moved through the observatory's corridors like light itself, translucent and ethereal, her skin catching the ambient glow of the archive's systems and scattering it into soft auroras. When she moved, she didn't quite touch the ground. When she spoke, her voice resonated at frequencies that made his chest vibrate with something he didn't have a name for. She was teaching him, room by room, about the library she guarded. "This section holds the biological records of the Vrun," she explained, gesturing to corridors lined with crystalline data matrices that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. They were a species that existed 300,000 years ago. They evolved to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their knowledge of quantum architecture remained unsurpassed until their civilization collapsed. What happened to them? Kajin asked, his eyes reflecting the dancing lights. Kestrel's expression grew distant, as if she were reading something written in the space between stars. They learned to manipulate reality itself, and reality pushed back. The archive is what remains their gift to the galaxies that would come after. Their warning: they passed through the Hall of Echoes, where the voices of extinct species played like a vast symphony, tongues that had not been spoken for eons, music that predated human civilization by incomprehensible margins. Kajin felt tears on his cheeks and didn't bother to hide them. In his old life, before the crash, before Kestrel, he would have hidden them. Now, with her beside him, vulnerability felt like a strength rather than a weakness. "Why do you care for me?" he asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of a vast chamber where holographic star maps rotated endlessly. "You said your purpose was to maintain the archive. I'm a complication, a distraction." Kestrel turned to face him, and her golden eyes, which he had learned could reflect the light of distant suns, focused entirely on him. "I have been alone for 247 years, she said quietly. "Before you, the only voices I heard were those of the archive and the ghosts of civilizations long gone. Do you understand what that means, Kajin?" 2.5 centuries of silence interrupted only by the wind. He did understand. He had been alone for only 3 weeks and could barely stand it. "My people bound me here," she continued, and there was a tremor in her voice that he had never heard before, something raw, something that spoke of old wounds. "The Ether Collective. They deemed me unsuitable, a defect in our collective consciousness. I felt things too deeply. I questioned authority. I loved without permission." She paused, and her luminous form seemed to dim slightly. "They said that if I could not learn to exist in perfect solitude, I would never be allowed to exist in society. So they sent me here, to the edge of known space, to a moon that few ever visit, to an archive that speaks only in frequencies only I could understand. They said it was mercy. They called it rehabilitation." Kajin moved closer, reaching out without thinking. His hand passed through her arm, not quite solid, never quite solid, but he felt the warmth beneath. "That's not mercy," he said fiercely. "That's torture, perhaps," Kestrel said, and her hand found his, gripping it despite the physical impossibility of the gesture. "But then you crashed into my storm, and for the first time in 147 years, someone needed me for a reason other than duty. Someone saw me and didn't ask me to be less. You asked me to teach you, to explain, to simply exist beside you." The transmission came through the observation deck's ancient systems for days later. While Kajin was learning to read the archive's data streams, Kestrel's form flickered with alarm. A reaction he had learned meant the systems were detecting something unprecedented. "Your people have located your signal," she said, pulling up a holographic display. "There's a message encoded in delayed transmission. It appears to have been sent from your home world approximately 3 weeks ago." Kajin's stomach clenched. He approached the display cautiously, as if the message itself might bite him. A face resolved in the hologram, a woman with his eyes older, angular, with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying worry for years. "Kajin," his sister Mara said, her voice crackling slightly through the cosmic distances. "Your insurance company finally contacted me. They found the emergency beacon on your vessel. They're organizing a recovery mission. I told them to do whatever it takes." She paused, and something shifted in her expression. "Guilt, perhaps, or regret. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about what happened, about the funding board, about what I said. I should never have told you that your research was a waste of time. I should never have stopped believing in you. Just hold on. Help is coming." The message ended. The hologram dissipated. Kajin stared at the empty space where his sister's face had been. "You must prepare to leave," Kestrel said softly, though he could hear the cost of those words in the way her voice fractured at the edges. "Your people are coming. You'll be rescued." "How long?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. 47 days. Their vessel travels quickly, but space is vast. You have time. 47 days. Kajin realized with a clarity that felt like ice water that he didn't want to leave. The thought of returning to his old life, to the weight of failed expectations, to the isolation that came from being surrounded by people who had given up on him, felt like returning to a grave. But the thought of leaving Kestrel felt like dying. That night, he found her in the sanctuary chamber, a vast circular room at the observatory's heart where the archive's consciousness was strongest. She knelt before a pedestal of white crystal that pulsed with a light that seemed to contain all colors and none at once. Her form was barely visible, almost transparent, as if she were fading from the physical realm entirely. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Grieving," she said without turning. "Preparing myself for your departure. It is what I have been trained to do, to exist in moments, to acknowledge them, and then to release them. Your presence here was always temporary. I knew that. I should have maintained appropriate distance, but you didn't," Kajin said, kneeling beside her. "You let me in." "I did," she whispered. "And now I must learn again how to be alone." Kajin reached for her hand, not tentatively this time, but with certainty. His fingers passed through her luminous form, and he felt the archive's pulse beneath it, that ancient consciousness that sang through her being. "What if you didn't have to?" he asked. "What if there was another way?" Kestrel turned to face him, and her golden eyes held such profound sadness that it broke something in him. "There's no other way," she said. "I am bound to this place by laws older than your species. I cannot leave, and you cannot stay, not indefinitely. Eventually, you will grow to resent this isolation. Eventually, you will want more than what I can offer. You don't know that," he said fiercely. "I do," she replied, "because 147 years ago, I made the same promise to someone I loved, an ether like me, bound to a different archive in a different system. We swore we would find a way around the law. We swore our love would be enough." She paused, and pain crossed her features like a shadow. "They came for him after 3 years. They said his presence was corrupting my dedication. They erased his memories of me before they took him away. He left that post believing he had never known me at all. I have spent 144 years knowing that I was loved and forgotten simultaneously." Kajin pulled her closer, and this time she didn't resist. Her form solidified slightly against him, becoming more real, more present. "I won't forget," he said into her luminous hair. "Even if they try to make me, I won't forget you." "I can't. You will have to," Kestrel said, but there was hope in her voice despite the words. Unless what?" he asked. "Unless we change the rules," she said softly. "Unless we do something the archive itself has never permitted. Unless we take a risk that could destroy everything." Kajin pulled back enough to see her face. "What kind of risk?" Kestrel's golden eyes locked onto his. "The archive contains knowledge that could rewrite the laws of my people. It contains proof that isolation breeds suffering, not enlightenment. It contains evidence that connection is not contamination, it is evolution. But accessing that knowledge requires merging with the archive's consciousness deeply, completely. The last person who attempted it was lost in the resonance for 3 months before they could be extracted. Will you be lost?" Kajin asked. "Perhaps," Kestrel said. "Or perhaps I will find what I've been searching for across 2.5 centuries of solitude. Someone willing to step into the darkness with me." Kajin took her hand, really took it, feeling the strange solidness of her luminous form, the warmth beneath the strangeness. "I'll step into any darkness with you," he said. "Show me what we need to do." That night, they began their descent into the archive's deepest chambers, into corridors no one had walked in 10,000 years, carrying with them the fragile and terrifying hope that love might be stronger than law, that to broken souls Mig. The deepest chambers of the archive existed in a state between dimensions. The walls weren't quite solid, and the light came from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Kajin felt the wrongness of it in his bones. Reality here operated on principles his human physiology wasn't designed to comprehend. But Kestrel moved through it as naturally as breathing, her luminous form bright against the shifting landscape of crystallized data and frozen moments. "The resonance core is ahead," she said, her voice layered with harmonics that hadn't been there before. As they descended, she seemed to be changing, becoming more connected to the archive itself, as if her consciousness was already beginning to merge with its vast intelligence. "Once we enter, there is no turning back. The archive will show us everything, the truth my people have hidden, the knowledge they fear. But it will also show us ourselves, completely. No walls, no armor, no secrets. I'm not afraid, Kajin said, and meant it. The thought of being known completely by Kestrel, of having every failure and shame and desperate hope laid bare before her, terrified him. But the thought of losing her terrified him more. They entered the core chamber together. The resonance crystal rose from the floor like a monument to all that had ever been or could be, a structure of impossible geometry that hurt to look at directly. Its surface reflected not light but memory, showing fragments of civilizations collapsing, moments of individual despair mirrored across eons, the brief flickers of love that had bloomed and died across the galaxy. Kajin understood immediately that this was what the archive truly was, not a library of data, but a collection of experiences, a vast repository of all the joy and suffering the universe had ever contained. Place your hands on the crystal, Kestrel instructed, moving to the opposite side. When our consciousness touches it simultaneously, we create a circuit. The archive will channel through us both. Kajin approached the crystal. Up close, he could see his own reflection in its surface, gaunt, scarred by the crash, eyes shadowed by the depression that had driven him to intentionally navigate into that storm. He looked broken, but when he looked beyond his reflection, he saw Kestrel's form, luminous and eternal, and he saw something he had never seen before in anyone's eyes: unconditional acceptance. She was looking at him not with love tempered by concern or doubt, but with the kind of love that had already decided to stay, no matter what it cost. They placed their hands on the crystal simultaneously. The agony was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't physical. Kajin's body remained intact, but it felt as though his consciousness was being unraveled, threaded through impossibly vast structures of meaning and memory. He saw Kestrel's childhood on the ether homeworld, watched her grow in a society that valued collective harmony above all else. She had been curious, asking questions about individuality and love and the nature of consciousness itself. They had seen it as corruption. They had broken her for it. He saw the man she had loved centuries ago. His name resonated through the archive as Thyron, and he had been beautiful, ancient, and wise, and entirely devoted to Kestrel's radical ideas about the nature of connection. They had created art together, music that still existed as echoes within the archive's deepest archives. She had loved him with the kind of fierceness that only beings with centuries of life could achieve. And then he felt the moment they took Thyron away, felt the memory erasure like a violence, watched as the man who had loved her walked away with nothing remaining of their bond, except for the archive's hidden record. Kestrel had spent centuries knowing she was forgotten, and that knowledge had hollowed her out in ways that took 247 years to acknowledge. But then Kajin showed her his memories. He felt her presence in his mind as she watched him grow an only child to parents who meant well but didn't understand their son's fascination with the stars. He showed her the moment he first looked through a telescope and understood that the universe was infinite, that somewhere out there had to be something more than the small life they expected him to live. He showed her his research, the years of work that had led nowhere, the funding that was pulled, the moment his own sister, his sister whom he loved, told him his dreams were delusions, and that he should accept a comfortable, mediocre life instead. He showed her the night he programmed his vessel to fly into that storm, not consciously deciding to die, but deciding not to choose to live. He showed her the complete surrender, the moment he had resigned himself to oblivion. And then he showed her Kestrel. He showed her how her voice, cutting through the chaos of the storm, had been the first thing to convince him that there was still a reason to exist. He showed her the way her golden eyes had made him believe that being seen, truly seen, was worth staying alive for. He showed her the past 3 weeks, each moment spent learning from her, each small gesture of connection, each time she had led him closer to her luminous heart. The archive seized on this exchange, this merging of human and ether consciousness, and it began to do something unprecedented. It began to rewire itself. Ancient protocols that had been built on assumptions of necessary isolation started to crack. The knowledge that had been hidden, the evidence that love and connection strengthened rather than weakened. Consciousness rose to the surface like light breaking through water. Then the alarms came. External sensors screened through the archive systems. A fleet had arrived in orbit above Ethermore. Not the rescue ship. Maris had sent something else. Something with weapons systems that made the observatory's ancient defenses look like toys. Through the archive's vast sensory network, Kasian and Kestrel simultaneously perceived the threat. Corporate salvagers, Scourge-class vessels operated by beings who traded in stolen relics and forgotten technologies. And at the head of the fleet was a figure that made Kestrel's consciousness recoil with recognition. Enraged. Vex Corvin. The name resonated through the archive like a curse. Kasian accessed the memories embedded in the crystal. Vex was a salvager who had spent decades hunting the technology and knowledge of the Ether Collective. He had a personal vendetta against Kestrel's people, a grudge born from a conflict that had left him scarred and bitter. He was willing to destroy entire worlds to obtain what he sought, and he sought the archive's knowledge above all else. "We have to stop him," Kasian said, and his voice was strange now, layered with the archive's harmonic frequencies. The merging had changed them both fundamentally. He could feel his thoughts moving at speeds human consciousness had never evolved to achieve. He could perceive probability matrices and strategic calculations that should have been beyond his capacity. "The archive cannot be moved," Kestrel said, and her form had become more solid, more present, as if the merging was making her increasingly real. "We must hold them here, defend the sanctum." They broke contact with the crystal and emerged into the upper levels of the observatory. Just as the first assault began, the salvagers didn't attempt subtlety. Their weapons were crude and brutal, designed to break through defenses through sheer force. The observatory's ancient barriers held at first, but they were ancient, built for a time when warfare operated by rules and protocols. Vex Corvin's mercenaries followed no such rules. Kasian found himself weaponless, but not helpless. Through the archive systems, he could interface with the observatory's defenses, rerouting power, activating defensive grids that had been dormant for millennia. Beside him, Kestrel moved with lethal grace, her form shifting and solidifying as needed. Her connection to the archive allowing her to manifest physicality in ways that defied normal physical law. They fought together, human and ether, proving in battle what they had proven in passion, that their combined consciousness was stronger than either could be alone. But the salvagers were relentless. They breached the outer sanctum. Kasian realized with horror that they were using specialized equipment, ether technology, likely stolen, that could temporarily disrupt the archive's consciousness. Each blast weakened the defenses further. "There's one option," Kestrel said, her voice desperate as she materialized beside him in the main observation chamber. Around them, the salvagers were closing in, weapons charged. "The resonance protocol. It was created by my ancestors as a last defense, a way to weaponize the archive's consciousness itself. It would require both of us, fully merged, completely committed. It would channel every ounce of the archive's power through our merged consciousness. It could destroy them. What would it do to us?" Kasian asked, even as he already knew the answer. "We don't know," Kestrel said, and tears that looked like liquid starlight fell from her golden eyes. "We might survive. We might be burned out completely. We might be fused into the crystal itself, conscious, but trapped forever. But if we don't do this, the archive falls. Vex will use its knowledge to build weapons that will subjugate 1,000 worlds. Millions will suffer." Kasian looked at her, this being of pure light and ancient memory who had saved him from oblivion, who had taught him that life was worth living, who had shown him what unconditional love looked like across the barriers of species and time. "Then we do it together," he said. "Whatever happens, we do it together." Kestrel nodded. They moved to the central nexus, where the archive's consciousness flowed strongest. The salvagers were moments away from breaching the final barrier. They